Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayana Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudirye Nashtiprayeshu Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavat Sevaya Bhagavati Uttam Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Nashti. So continuing with the discussion on Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 11, Chapter 5, Narad concludes his teachings to Vasudeva. Text number 8 onwards. So Chamas Rishi is further speaking. Vadanti te anyo anyam upasita striyo griheshu maithanya pareshu chashisha yajanti srishtana na vidhana dakshinam vritya param ghananti pashun tadvidaha. The materialistic followers of Vedic rituals, giving up the worship of the Lord, instead practically worship their wives and thus their homes, become dedicated to sex life. Such materialistic householders encourage one another in such whimsical behavior. Understanding ritualistic sacrifice as a necessary item for bodily maintenance, they perform unauthorized ceremonies in which there is no distribution of foodstuffs or charity to the Brahmins and other respectable persons. Instead, they cruelly slaughter animals such as goats without any understanding of the dark consequences of their activities. So the topic that is going on, following the Vedic rituals without understanding the philosophy and without understanding the essence of Vedic rituals, which is to worship Krishna. But people, materialistic people, they just follow some Vedic rituals to get some more money, go more opulence, so that they can live comfortably. That's the whole idea. But they don't understand how much karmic reactions there will be. And then in the process, what they do is they get attached to their wives and sex indulgence and slaughter of animals. It's just a vicious, dark cycle. False pride is certainly not complete without sex indulgence. Thus, lusty materialistic householders are not attracted to worshipping saintly persons, but rather worship their wives as a source of constant sex pleasure. The mentality of such condemned persons is described by the Lord himself in Bhagavad Gita. They say in 16th chapter, Krishna said, the demons think, so much wealth do I have today, and I'll gain more according to my schemes. So much is mine now, and it will increase in the future more and more. Generally, materialistic householders consider themselves to be very religious. In fact, by earning money to support a band of relatives, they consider themselves to be more pious than the irresponsible sadhus who do not struggle to maintain family members. Worshipping the material body, they're contemptuous of the humble Brahmins who are generally not very advanced in economic development. They consider such so-called beggars to be unworthy objects of charity and instead perform sacrifices only for the enhancement of the false prestige of their own family members. So this is the whole purpose. And this is exactly what Krishna speaks in the 16th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. The mentality of demoniac persons and what they do. Madhvacharya has stated in this regard, Upekshya vai harim te tu bhutva yajya patantiyata. In spite of proudly considering themselves to be great performers of religious ceremonies, those who neglect the Lord and his devotees certainly fall down. Such foolish persons sometimes bless each other by saying, may you be blessed with the wealth of gorgeous flower garlands, sandalwood bulb, and beautiful women. I mean, this is how they talk among each other, because for them, wealth is everything. Opulence means everything. That's what they are after. Men who are controlled by the nature of women become exactly like women. Materialistic women are uninterested in the devotional service of the Supreme Lord and strive for their own selfish happiness. Therefore, they eagerly take service from their husbands and become most discouraged if the husband prefers to serve the personality of Godhead. And this goes on. This we have seen personally. Being lost in such a fool's paradise, both husband and wife mutually encourage each other in temporary happiness. They do not like to speak or hear about the pastimes of the Lord, but prefer to discuss their own families. Still, the devotees of the Lord, being mature in the mode of goodness, are always ready to act mercifully towards such conditioned souls, just like vain animals. It's devotees because they are merciful. They want to act, they want to help these kind of people. When the devotees of the Lord preach that human beings should not slaughter animals, materialistic householders are very often astonished and inquire if it is actually possible to subsist on a vegetarian diet. Thus, being completely ignorant of the material mode of goodness, what to speak of spiritual knowledge, such condemned materialists have no hope beyond the mercy of the devotees of the Lord. So this is their only hope, with the hope that they hold on to this hope. But many times they don't, because their Agyat Sukriti is not that much. But Krishna's mercy, sooner or later, they come into contact with devotees again, and hopefully they take up the process. Shriya vibhutya bhijanena vidyaya tyagena rupena balena karmana jatasme nandhiya saheshvara sato avamanyanti haripriyan kalaha. The intelligence of cruel-minded persons is blinded by false pride based on great wealth, opulence, prestigious family connections, education, renunciation, personal beauty, physical strength, and successful performance of Vedic rituals. Being intoxicated with this false pride, such cruel persons blaspheme the Supreme Personality of Godhead and His devotees. The attractive qualities exhibited by the conditioned souls originally belong to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is the reservoir of all attractive qualities. The moonshine is actually the reflected effulgence of the sun. Similarly, the living entity reflects for a brief time a particular quantity of Lord's opulences. Not knowing this, atheistic persons become intoxicated by such reflected opulences and thus blinded. They condemn themselves more and more by criticizing the Lord and His devotees. They are unable to understand how they have become abominable, and it is difficult to prevent them from going to hell. But it's very difficult for especially for the people who have some opulence to understand this. They just love to criticize the Lord and His devotees. And here it is very nicely written. Whatever opulence anybody has, it just reflects for a brief time. It just has some kind of reflection, or as Krishna says, Srimad Urjitam Evava. I mean, they just spark of His splendor. And the spark, how long does a spark last? Not for too long. But it just makes anybody crazy when they have it. And then they cannot stand the sight of the Lord or His devotees. Sarveshu shashvatanu bhritsvavavsthitam yathakam atmanam abhishtam ishwaram vedopagitam chana shranvate abudha manorathanam pravadanti vartaya. The personality of Godhead is eternally situated within the heart of every embodied being. Still, the Lord remains situated apart, just as the sky, which is all pervading, does not mix with any material object. Thus, the Lord is a supreme worshipable object and the absolute controller of everything. He is elaborately glorified in the Vedic literature, but those who are bereft of intelligence do not like to hear about him. They prefer to waste their time discussing their own mental concoctions, which inevitably deal with gross material sense gratification such as sex life and meat eating. In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna says, Vedesha sarve raham vidya. The goal of all Vedic knowledge is to know the Lord, who is the absolute truth. Although this purpose of the Vedas is clearly revealed both in the Vedic literature itself and by the self-realized acharyas, foolish people cannot grasp this simple truth. They prefer to cultivate knowledge of illicit sex by discussing their sexual partners and experiences. They also eagerly describe and recommend to their friends the best restaurants for eating meat, and they're fond of glorifying drugs and liquor by elaborately describing the drunken and hallucinogenic effects of their sinful experiences. And this is what happens. Whenever all these people get together, they're not going to discuss Krishna or Krishna Katha. No way. All they discuss is how drunk they got in some other party and what nonsense activities they did. And they just laugh and they enjoy. And the other person will describe his experiences of becoming stupid under the influence of drugs and liquor and whatever. And this is that's the whole glorification of each other, doing some nonsense activities. The materialistic sense gratifiers eagerly call one another on the telephone, congregate in clubs and committees, and enthusiastically go on hunting, drinking, and gambling excursions, thus filling their lives with the mode of ignorance. More and more mode of ignorance. That's all. They have neither the time nor the inclination to discuss the absolute truth, Krishna. Unfortunately, they neglect the Supreme Lord, who therefore severely punishes such foolish persons in order to bring them back to their senses. Everything belongs to the Lord, and everything is meant for the Lord's enjoyment. When the living entity dovetails his activities for the pleasure of the Lord, he experiences unlimited happiness. There is actually no happiness in material affairs, and the Lord mercifully punishes the intoxicated, conditioned souls to bring him back to his real life. And whatever this drinking, taking drugs, and other activities they do, ultimately leads to what? Very, very bad health. And this is how Krishna punishes them. Maybe bodily health is gone, or sometimes the accidents happen, but still, people just don't want to give it up. Unfortunately, materialistic persons do not heed the advice of the Supreme Lord in the Bhagavad Gita or that of the Lord's representatives who speak in allied literature such as Srimad Bhagavatam. Instead, such sense gratifiers consider themselves to be most eloquent and learned. Every materialistic person actually feels that he is the most intelligent person, and thus he has no time to hear the actual truth. Nevertheless, the personality of Godhead, as described in this verse, waits patiently within the heart of the conditioned soul, encouraging him to recognize the Lord who is sitting beside him. Such recognition of the personality of Godhead is the beginning of all auspiciousness and happiness for the conditioned soul. But I guess this is the last thing on the list to do, is to surrender or even take the name of Krishna in a devotional mode. लोके vayam isham adya seva nitya hi jantor nahi tatra chautana vyavastite teshu vivaha yagya suragra harasu nivrittirishta. In this material world, the conditioned soul is always inclined to sex, meat eating, and intoxication. Therefore, religious scriptures never actually encourage these activities. Although the scriptural injunctions provide for sex through sacred marriage, for meat eating through sacrificial offerings, and for intoxication through the acceptance of ritual cups of wine, such ceremonies are meant for the ultimate purpose of renunciation. So Vivaha is also, as I mentioned here, is Vivaha Yagya. Yagya means it's a spiritual activity, and the purpose will be renunciation or attachment to the Lord, if it is done properly. Those who are not situated in pure Krishna consciousness are always inclined towards material sense gratification in the form of illicit sex, meat eating, and intoxication. They simply desire a party life of eat, drink, and be merry. Such materialistic persons are unwilling to give up such temporary gratification because they're firmly bound up in the bodily concept of life. For such persons, there are numerous Vedic injunctions for rituals that bestow material sense pleasure in a regulated manner. The conditioned soul thereby becomes accustomed to indirectly worshipping the Supreme Lord by accepting the austerity of regulated sense gratification in obedience to the Vedic way of life. Through purification, the living entity gradually develops a higher taste and becomes directly attracted to the spiritual nature of the Lord. So it takes a long procedure to bring a materialistic person on the path of bhakti. Sometimes the fallen practitioners of the Karma Kanda section of the Vedas assert that the material fruitive results of Vedic ceremonies should never be given up because they are prescribed by the religious scriptures. For example, there is a Vedic injunction that in the proper season, a husband must approach his wife at night at least 5 days after her menstrual period if the wife has properly bathed and cleansed herself. Thus, a responsible householder should engage in religious sex life. The injunction that one must approach his wife for sex life is explained by the Vaishnava Acharyas as follows. Within the material world, almost every man is very lusty and desires passionate sex life with every attractive woman he meets, or with any women at all. Actually, for an ordinary materialistic man, it is an accomplishment if he can restrict himself to relationships with his lawfully wedded wife. But because familiarity breeds contempt, the natural tendency is for the husband to gradually become envious or resentful of the wife and desire illicit connections with other women. Such a mentality is most sinful and abominable, and the Vedic scripture therefore orders that one must approach his actual wife with a desire to beget children and thus curtail the tendency towards illicit sexual connection with other women. Were there no such Vedic injunctions ordering one to approach his wife only, many men would naturally be inclined to neglect their wives and pollute other women by illicit connection. So behind every injunction, rule, there is some reason. It's just we have to understand that rule properly. However, such an injunction for conditioned souls does not apply to great souls who are fixed on the spiritual platform and are transcendental to material sex desires. As stated in this verse, Nivrittir Ishta, the actual purpose of the Vedic scriptures is to bring one back home, back to Godhead, back to the spiritual world. So for that, whatever one has to do to purify the consciousness and remain in mode of goodness, to avoid all things that will hamper his progress in the spiritual path, one has to do it. The Vedic regulations governing married sex life are actually meant to prevent sinful illicit sex. However, one should not foolishly conclude that a lusty attraction to his wife's naked body is a perfection of self-realization and Vedic elevation. Actual perfection of spiritual life is to become free from all material desires and to fix the mind on Krishna. So for that, one has to follow so much of practices. Similarly, there are other injunctions governing the regulated consumption of liquor and meat. Those who are mad after meat eating are instructed to perform Vedic ceremonies by which they are permitted to consume 5 types of 5-clawed animals, namely the rhinoceros, turtle, rabbit, porcupine, and lizard. Who wants to eat those? Similarly, the consumption of specific liquors is allowed during highly restricted sacrifices performed on the specific days of the year at great expense. In this way, other types of drunkenness and cruel animal slaughter are prohibited. One is gradually purified by performing such sacrifices, and he develops a distaste for such foolish activities as meat eating and drinking of liquor. The Vedic rules and regulations that gradually restrict sense gratification are called vidhi. So followed to. Some vidhi means something that we have to follow. The word niyam refers to injunctions governing activities that human beings ordinarily would not be inclined to perform. So that is niyam. Yam and niyam. So many things are there in the scriptures, but basically they are there so that we can make progress spiritually. That is what the human life is for. But nowadays it is like, oh, who likes to eat this ghas foos, means the vegetarian stuff. I like to eat non-veg and drink liquor and do all sorts of nonsense. Well, then the last chapter of 5th canto of Bhagavatam is very, very much applicable to them. And then you have to go through this kind of hell and these kind of punishments. Simple as that. In the movement of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, it can be observed that those who desire to become advanced devotees of Krishna immediately give up all such fruitive sacrifices. There is no scope in pure devotion service for any type of fruitive sacrifice. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu demanded that all of his sincere followers engage 24 hours a day in Shravanam Kirtanam Vishnu, hearing and chanting the glories of the personality of Godhead. Those who claim to be followers of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and who are seriously planning on going back to God in the very near future should not become mindlessly attracted by Vedic rituals that are meant to attract those who are hopelessly bound up in the material bodily concept of life. So these rituals are not for us, for devotees who are already on the path back home, back to Godhead. But those who still have material mind, material conditioning, okay, they can perform. But the idea is once they start performing, they'll understand what nonsense it is and why perform this. And the results we get are very, very minute and temporary. So what's the point? So I guess we can stop here. See anybody has any questions or comments? Okay, so you all have a safe and wonderful day. Hare Krishna. Jai Srila Prabhupada.
Hare Krishna. Jai